The former Holmesburg Prison, given the loving nickname the Terror Dome, was a prison that was operated by the city of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, as well as the Pennsylvania Department of Prisons, PDP, from 1896 to 1995. The site was, well, a prison, and as you might imagine, it wasn't exactly a pleasant place to be, but that's the nature of prisons generally. However, Holmesburg in particular became much worse due to a series of human experiments that started being conducted at the invitation of prison officials by a doctor named Albert Kligman. The experiments involved microwave radiation, sulfuric and carbonic acid, as well as untested drugs, and other harmful chemical agents applied to the skin. Hello, welcome to another episode of History in the Dark. I am your host, Darkness the Curse, and before we begin, as always, thank you so much to my generous patrons, my British rail critics, and of course my underwater train finders. You are the reason why this content remains absolutely horrific. And today, we are going to discuss, yes, the Holmesburg prison experiments, and the effects they had on the people that suffered under them. This is the story of Albert Kligman's Acres of Skin. Humanity has a difficult history involving human experimentation. There are an alarming number of examples that can be given regarding testing of various things on human beings. Now, the ethical constraints of doing this kind of thing over time have gotten way stricter, because, well, it is easy to imagine how bad this sort of thing can go, depending on what is being tested. These days, in order to conduct human trials, you need a significant amount of FDA approvals, as well as a basic understanding of how to conduct an ethical experimentation, and all involved must give proper full consent before any testing can be conducted. Enter Dr. Albert Montgomery Kligman, who was born March 17, 1916, to a pair of Jewish immigrants, which is actually deeply ironic now that I think about it. As a child, he was actually a Boy Scout and had a love of plants, and with the financial support of Simon Greenberg, who was a major rabbi, he attended the Pennsylvania State University, where he earned a bachelor's degree in 1939. He went on to receive a PhD in botany from the University of Pennsylvania in 1942, and he specialized in the study of fungi. He actually went on in his schooling, however, entering the university's medical program, and earned his MD in 1947, specializing in dermatology. He did this because he wanted to apply his expertise in fungi to dermatological treatments. It is relevant. Certain funguses have varying effects on human skin, which can be irritating and traumatic sometimes. And at the time, he had a very bright future. He was a smart guy, and he did want to help treat people with serious skin conditions. And upon graduation, he joined the dermatology faculty as an associate, as well as signing on at the Hospital of the University of Pennsylvania. He was a prolific scholar, and was known for bringing scientific rigor to a field that at the time really didn't have that much interest. And he wrote numerous papers on conditions that had often been overlooked because they weren't that serious, like athlete's foot and dandruff, which helped in their treatment, because while neither of those conditions are generally life-threatening or anything, they are pretty irritating, and he wanted to help people get better. His best-known contribution to the field was actually for the treatment of acne. He was a co-inventor of Retin-A, a type of medication that's still used under prescription from a doctor. This, of course, earned him significant royalties, but he was a generous supporter of the Department of Dermatology and donated over $4 million to them by 1998. So all this makes him sound like a pretty okay guy. He was a doctor who helped people, and maybe none of his insight necessarily helped with life-threatening illnesses, but acne can be quite annoying, sometimes very demoralizing psychologically for people, as can athlete's foot and dandruff. They're cosmetic, but cosmetic issues can cause people troubles, especially mentally. You don't want to look bad to other people. You don't want to get made fun of in high school for having too many pimples. You don't want to lose out on dates because of your face. Dr. Kligman was helping people with that, and it was a field that desperately needed great minds like his. But he would kind of shoot his own career in the foot because he's most well known for his unethical experiments. In 1951, prison officials at the Holmesburg Prison invited Kligman to start doing some experiments to help with the treatment of athlete's foot on their prison population. This invitation stemmed from early testing of treatments for ringworm, but he found that the environment had a ton of possibilities. There was a lot of stuff he could do here that he couldn't do anywhere else, mainly because of those filthy things like ethics and rules and restriction and Hippocratic oaths and things like that. Now, it is important to stress that at first things were well intended. The prison did have an outbreak of athlete's foot, and it was annoying the prisoners, and the staff genuinely believed Kligman could help. But over time, things started to change. While he did help with the athlete's foot issue, other experiments soon followed, with Kligman sometimes visiting, early on at least, without any authorization. He infected them with ringworm, he infected them with skin viruses like herpes simplex, as well as various yeasts. Then they started into the biochemical experiments, like dioxin, which was the poisonous substance in Agent Orange. The Dow Chemical Company called for those experiments themselves and paid Kligman to do them, $10,000 to be precise. The dosages the inmates were subjected to were 468 times greater than those detailed in the company's protocols. The United States Army also contracted Kligman to test the effects of certain mind-altering drugs, which sounds like a really great idea to do in a prison. Thank you for that. Those experiments were conducted in trailers on the prison grounds. Subjects from this set of experiments said that they weren't actually aware what drugs they were given due to the lack of consent forms. The drugs they got produced a variety of lasting effects, like temporary paralysis or sudden long-term violent behavior. Oh good. And half of them reported they experienced hallucinations for days. Many of the prisoners stayed away from the Army experiments due to rumors they involved LSD and resulted in participants going crazy. It is important to stress that while the experiments were outrageously unethical, the prisoners did actually have the ability to opt out. They weren't forced into it. They actually received monetary compensation for participating, which was a big deal for them. The problem is that they often weren't informed exactly what they were in for, so the idea of informed consent was thrown out the window. Yeah, they were being paid for their participation, but it was kind of like being said, I will give you $300 to take this pill. And you say, okay, I would love $300. Turns out the pill is cyanide! Like, that's the problem here, is that they didn't really know what they were doing. They just knew they were getting paid for it, and they were prisoners. They didn't have a lot of options. The company Johnson & Johnson was also involved in this kind of testing, and one prisoner, named Edward Anthony, recalls signing up for one of their studies to see if a bubble bath product was harmful to someone with open wounds. He developed blisters, as well as fine little red bumps all over his face, arms, legs, and head. He quit the test early because he was in so much pain, but even after that, his back continued to feel like it was on fire. And many surviving prisoners experienced a range of long-term health effects. Skin problems, cancers, and undetermined illnesses that couldn't exactly be ironed out. In some cases, the prisoners were told that the things they were taking should have no side effects, and then they did have a lot of horrific side effects. There was also testing of possible chemical weapons. While the United States advocated for the banning of chemical weapons at the Geneva Convention of 1925, they continued to develop them anyway, just in case someone would decide to use them and we had to use them back. That's kind of our thing. We're a little hypocritical like that. And of course, many of these compounds were actually tested at the Holmesburg Prison. 254 different compounds to be precise. Among those reagents were acutely toxic anticholinesterase chemicals, where the most significant one was known as EA3167, which was actually discovered when a researcher had accidentally injected himself in the thumb. That researcher immediately suffered from brain and nerve damage, and the compound became of interest to the military. 19 male patients were chosen between the ages of 22 and 37 based on the results of the Minnesota Multi-Phase Personality Inventory, MMPI test. Those first experiments were moderate, and measured standard vitals such as heart rate and blood pressure, no big deal. These tests quickly ramped up in severity, both in terms of the number of patients they were utilizing, as well as the number of chemical compounds. Over 320 inmates were recruited to test ditrin, entropin, scopolamine, and various other glycolate agents, which affected the nervous activity and function of smooth muscles. And it wasn't even very experimental. Normally in experiments you would increase the dosage by small incremental amounts, but these often increased dosage by 40%, which was way higher. Then, of course, remember, it was the Cold War, and people were worried about a nuclear war. Yes, of course, they did radioactive testing. Kligman applied for a byproduct material license to the U.S. Atomic Energy Commission to store radioactive isotopes specifically for testing on Holmesburg prisoners. Before the Cold War, the use of radioactive isotopes medically had been pretty restricted to X-rays, which are still used now. Yeah, there's a little radiation involved, but they're more helpful than harmful. As long as you don't get like 57 X-rays in a day, you're fine. Kligman wanted to test the turnover rate of the human skin. Human skin was radioactively labeled, and anywhere from 50 to 200 subjects from Holmesburg were tested on. Kligman actually defended himself on this test in particular, as he claimed that the radioactive thymidine that was being used posed no threat to the patients because it was excised within minutes, so the only damage done would be on the experiment area on their skin, and that radioactive materials were also never left consciously within an inmate's body. This particular study was actually overseen by the dermatology department at the University of Pennsylvania. The dioxin testing is actually where the experiments were first brought to light, due to the release of an expose in the Philadelphia Inquirer on January 11, 1981. Dow Chemical had been selling pesticides for use as, well, weed control, but the problem was their particular pesticides were linked to fetal cancers upon exposure, specifically the one known as TCDD. The EPA banned them from producing that particular chemical, but Dow vehemently opposed that ban, and the reason they partnered with the University of Pennsylvania and the Holmesburg Prison was to prove that their chemical was safe. Pesticides were injected into patients to establish safety threshold dosages. In many of those cases, excessive doses would produce chloracne, inflammatory pustules on the skin, as well as papules that lasted 4 to 7 months at a time. Throughout the experiments, over 10 patients have been given over 7,500 micrograms of the dioxin-based pesticide, which was considered an excessive amount, and even Dow didn't think they were going to give them that much. When news of the experiments was brought to light by the Philadelphia Inquirer, the New York Times jumped into the story too, and the outcry was pretty brutal, since the experiments were compared to the Holocaust. And while they weren't quite that severe, they were still pretty friggin' unethical. Kligman continued to maintain a really nonchalant opinion of the whole affair, going as far as to say, all those people could have leukemia now, about 1 chance in 20 billion. I could be hit by an asteroid when I walk out on the street, but I don't think I will. Kligman! This is so not the same thing, man. Like, I get that they were paying the prisoners, but they still weren't really telling them exactly how dangerous this was. Also, you were injecting so much pesticide into them that even Dow Chemical was like, yo, dude, that's not what we wanted. There were several defenders beyond Kligman, including Solomon McBride, who was an administrator of the prisons. He was convinced there was nothing wrong with the experimentation at the Holmesburg prison. He felt that it was nothing more than strapping patches of cloth with lotion or cosmetics onto the backs of patients, and argued that it was a means for the prisoners to earn an easy income. And maybe if the chemicals were already tested consistently on, say, lab mice, I might agree, but that's not what was happening here. The chemicals that were being tested were not just pharmaceutical in nature, and not just cosmetic. Some of them were meant to be weapons. Some were meant to be pesticides. Things that by their nature are toxic. That's exactly what they're for, to be toxic. So his point kind of falls a little flat. The case was made that the prisoners often wanted to participate in these tests due to the monetary reward, and that was true, but that led to other problems, such as some prisoners who were willing to go through the tests, just having more money than others, and trying to use that money to bribe other prisoners for, well, favors. Use your imagination on that one. It didn't make the prison a better place at all. Unless, of course, you were willing to inject poison into your body, and some, despite the money, really weren't. And eventually the testing was finally halted. Public opinion was generally against utilizing prisoners in this manner, especially considering that they couldn't give proper informed consent because they often weren't actually told how severe the testing was. Had that been going on, it may have been a little bit different. I mean, if someone is perfectly willing to test a pesticide on their body and is acutely aware of how severe the effects could be, I mean, if they sign the form, it's on them, as long as they know, and are a conscious adult with a proper mental capacity, you know? Like, there was a way to do it where you could call it ethical because as long as they knew, it's on them. But at the same time, they're prisoners, so they didn't have a lot of income options, and many would be more desperate than, say, not prisoners. So even in the instance of proper informed consent, there's still some ethical concerns here. As a result of the public outrage, human testing on prisoners was phased out in the United States entirely. Later, the matter was brought to trial, with some prisoners suing Dr. Kligman, Dow Chemical, as well as the Pennsylvania University. But they actually lost the suit due to the statute of limitations. It also didn't help that their case focused on the Nuremberg Code, which, while the United States has been strong enforcers of it, they hadn't actually followed it until the 1990s, which was after the testing was ceased. In 1995, Holmesburg Prison was closed. As for Kligman, other than being sued, he never faced any real punishment for the experiments. He lived to the age of 93, when he died of a heart attack in February 2010. And he could be remembered as a guy that helped patients with their skin conditions, but instead he's mostly known for a quote he made to the Evening Bulletin in Philadelphia in 1966. "All I saw before me were acres of skin. It was like a farmer seeing a fertile field for the first time." And with that, a special thank you goes out to all my underwater train finders: Some Dude 267, Orange Glass, Benjamin Owens, Spencer Kitsune 131-232, Josh Johnson, Middle for Life Guy, Anzac A1, Arthur Roy, Tommy Rossini, Lord Captain Von Thrust III, Joshua Long, Brian, Jack Carson's Royal Videos, Hayden Negro, Master of None, Lord R444, Alaric Jaspers, The Baxter, That Guy with a Beard, Mark Holding, Lock Kraken, Murder Drones Doll, A Person 723, DM Trouble Typhoon, Ohio Trucker 1, Hendrick Motorsports Fan 5, Alfonso Lapuche, Royal Hudson 2860, Isurfer 1405, Charles Kwiatkowski, and Dr. Racer 78. Till next time, this is Darkness, and I bid you all a fond farewell.